Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. Thank you so very much for joining me this evening, wherever you are in the world, and I do hope that you're incredibly well and that you've had a fabulous day because you deserve to have the best day ever. And before we get settled down to enjoy a lovely cozy story, don't forget to get that lovely hot cup of cocoa or tea because you're going to need it because tonight's story is absolutely lovely. We've got so many long haul truck drivers who drive those during the night when the witching hours are occurring and all kinds of exciting things tend to happen. So we've got another one of those amazing, exciting stories tonight. But don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, I'm so delighted that a couple of truckers have finally come forward with their fascinating encounters while driving along our North American highways. And so although I've kept my strange encounters secret for so long, I've decided to share them with you and your audience, who I'm delighted to see appear to have such open minds. Before I became a trucker, I was such a contemptuous, derisive person, a hardened cynic that quite literally had no belief in things that I could not physically see or explain. But boy, did that change after trucking for a few long years. I now know emphatically that there are things out there going on, most commonly in the dark shadows of the night, that truly defy natural explanation. How do I know this? Because I've experienced them for myself, and there is nothing like a one-on-one encounter with the supernatural to make the hardened skeptic in you metamorphosize into a believer. What about the spurious, fictitious Bigfoot accounts? Are they real too, you may wonder? And I will use this platform to tell you emphatically as a trucker that I have seen him on more than one occasion, and yes, Bigfoot is very definitely real. This elusive creature that many doubt exists is indeed roaming our forests in North America, and I can assure you of that because I've seen him myself. Before I became a trucker, the very idea of Bigfoot existing would have left me hooting with laughter, as I would find such a bizarre suggestion hilariously funny. I'm shamefully penitent to admit this to you and your listeners, but now I reluctantly look back at the old me and realise how pompous, haughty and arrogant I was to so righteously assume I knew absolutely everything about absolutely nothing. Looking back, I realise how naive, benighted and ignorant I truly was. My name is Tyler and I grew up in Atlanta in the early 80s with my brother Jordan and my sister Elise, in a very dysfunctional, maladjusted home with a very formidable father whom we feared greatly. He was the headmaster of a local school and governed the school with a rod of iron, much like he dominated his own home, and he always treated us children as if we were more like students than his own kids, so there was no love lost between any of us. He earned the formidable, unflattering nickname Mr. Bluebottom, because in those days he was not afraid to lash you hard with a leather belt, and it would hurt so bad it was almost impossible not to cry out in anguish and pain. I remember you were literally disabled from sitting on your derriere for a couple of days after one of his hectic beatings, because your wallet bottom would quite literally turn an ominous shade of blue from the bruising. Many parents admired how my father, Mr. Bluebottom, towed everyone into line, but he used fear as a powerful crushing weapon to subdue and control, as well as suppress and curb our naturally mischievous and adventurous spirits that are so typical of young boys. At home it was 1,000 times worse, believe me, than at school, and even my mother was so terrified of our dad, and before he even returned home she'd be working herself up into a huge frenzied lather because she was possibly more terrified of seeing him than we actually were. When my father was at home, no one ever spoke a word, and our home was filled with the ominous sound of reticent silence. At dinner all you could hear was the sound of cutlery on our plates as we tucked into our meal around the formal dinner table without ever saying a word, and it would have seemed that my father approved of the stoic, unnatural silence, and if anyone dared to speak a word, they were severely reprimanded. He would say, "It is better for children to be seen and not heard, so eat up and shut up if you know what's good for you." So in truth, every mealtime became a living hell because the silence was absolutely deafening and would leave me languishing with feelings of great apprehension and dread. One day my mother surprised us all by throwing her dinner plate across the table, and we watched in absolute horror as the china plate smashed, breaking into thousands of pieces, and we saw spaghetti, tomato sauce and mince fly all over the table and dribble down the walls in a sorrowful, bloody-looking mess that was symbolic of the messed-up state of our lives at the time. "I've had about as much as I can take of this tortuous dolor existence," she screamed. "I'm sick and tired of being Miss Perfect, and I cannot take it any more. It's all so fake. Come, Elise," she said to my sister, "we're going now." I was very impressed by my mother's courageous outburst, because she was normally as quiet as a church mouse, but I think that deep down she was like a pressure cooker waiting to explode, and when she did finally erupt, there was no going back for her. We all sat at the dinner table absolutely terrified, too silent and afraid to intervene or say anything for fear of experiencing the wrathful indignation and brutal chastisement from my dad. I watched my mother and my sister put on their coats and grab a suitcase, and they climbed into my mother's Dodger car. I heard the car doors slamming behind them, the engine purring, and then they were gone. And when I say gone, I literally mean gone forever from our lives. That was the last time I saw my mother and sister for many long years, and I really resented the fact that she left us boys to be raised by our obnoxious father all on our own. It took me a long time to forgive my mother for that, as it was like she was leaving 2 goldfish with a piranha, and that wasn't nice. I remember that night with such crystal clear clarity. My father turned around and looked at both of us and said, "I guess it's just the 3 of us now. If your mother thinks I'm going to take her back after such a horrendous effusive outburst, she can think again. Now get all this mess cleaned up at once and go to bed. It looks like an animal's been slaughtered in here." I was amazed that my father displayed absolutely no emotion, nor even sadness about what had just transpired with my mother and her grievous outburst, but he never ever knew how to express love. All these years later, I emphatically believe that my father was a self-effacing narcissist. In fact, I'm almost sure of it. After several years of being beaten black and blue by our dad and being bullied, belittled, humiliated and reprimanded day after day and night after night, you can see why I was eager to become a truck driver. My father was bullying and coercing me to take a law degree, but I wanted to get out of his parental clutches as soon as I possibly could, and quite literally I saw trucking as my physical and emotional salvation, and believe me, it was. As soon as I was old enough, I was driving a long-haul truck on those North American highways, and for the first time in my life I did feel gloriously unconfined and free. Most truck drivers find the hardest part of the job being away from home, but for me, being away from home was the most liberating thing about the job. I did, of course, miss my younger brother, who had to put up with my dad for another year or so until he could finally break free from my father's shackles. I was much younger than all the other truckers driving at the time, but as the need for truck drivers was so critical, thankfully my age was overlooked. I was competent and efficient and met all my delivery windows, and so after a while my employers became confident in hiring my services, and I acquired a definitive reputation. Driving during the daytime did have its distinct disadvantages for me, because I would get frustrated with checkpoints and hold-ups on the road that could sometimes wreak havoc by hindering time schedules quite significantly and cause major setbacks. The first thing I noticed when I began to drive my truck is just how astronomically gigantesque and magnificent North America actually is, and I was also astonished by the never-ending, immeasurable space of our great and wonderful, marvellous land. I must admit some of the areas I drove through were so exquisitely beautiful. It was difficult not to take off some personal time to go exploring, but that was unfortunately not conceivably possible. I would drive through a kaleidoscope of different scenery, from glorious emerald green rolling hills, snow-capped mountains, pastures dotted with grazing horses and cows, pretty little barns, rustic-looking homes, silvery lakes, pretty ponds, ubiquitous areas of forest, not forgetting some of those idyllic rural towns. It was all incredibly picturesque and absolutely charming. One day I decided to start driving at night, and just for a change, and also because I thought it would be interesting, exhilarating experience, and believe me, it really was. There were significant disadvantages, of course, to driving at night, but the huge benefits in terms of the excessive traffic congestion far outweighed the negative effects. One evening I was driving down the road and came upon a hit-and-run accident. I say that because there was a woman lying in the middle of the road, bleeding out furiously, and it looked like someone had driven over her legs as they had been severed from her body and were lying yards away from her torso. It was the most horrific sight I've ever seen. It seemed incredulous to me that she was still actually alive. I could hardly believe what I was seeing, and in that moment I wasn't sure quite how to react, because I was so shocked by this frightfully macabre and gruesome sight. My heart was pounding violently in my chest, and I could see the woman looking up at me in the truck with these anguished, disheartened eyes that appeared to be begging me to help her. I immediately called 911, although I knew it was far too late for this woman, and she probably had only moments left to live. But I knew that I didn't want her to die all alone without making an effort to finally comfort her. What on earth was I going to say to someone who had seconds left to live, I wondered in horror. I was not good at consoling people at the very best of times. Maybe she had a message she wanted me to convey to a loved one, I thought. I climbed out of my truck hastily and ran towards the middle of the road, but the woman was not there. The tarmac of the highway was undisturbed, still warm from the day, and very smooth, and there was absolutely no evidence of blood-staining anywhere. Was I going stark raving mad, I wondered to myself. I was beginning to wonder about my own mental faculties. Maybe I was overtired, too exhausted. Had I been driving too long? Was I now hallucinating? Yet I know what I saw, and the picture was embedded in my mind like a graving on a tombstone. You don't just imagine things like that, with such vivid recall. It was not even conceivably possible. My imagination wasn't even that good. I was certain I'd seen a woman lying in the middle of the road, dying after a hit-and-run accident, and now I was beginning to ambiguously doubt what I'd actually seen. When the emergency services did arrive, I explained to them what I'd seen and apologised profusely that I must have been seeing things, because what I'd seen had been so vivid and so clear to me. One of the EMTs asked me to report what I'd seen to her, and she went as white as a sheet when I recalled what I believed I had just witnessed on the road. I watched the colour literally drain from her face in horror. Her eyes grew as round as saucers, and her chin hung in an open, fixed gasp. What you saw was very real and incredibly accurate, she reassured me. I was here when I attended to a woman a year ago. She was lying in the middle of the road, having been mown down by a hit-and-run driver on the spot of the highway a year earlier, exactly as you described. The woman you recounted fits her description so perfectly, down to the very last detail. Her legs were indeed severed in the way you describe, and she bled out and was dead before we were able to attend to her medically. Now I was the one that was shaking. Well, what the heck did I see then? I asked the EMT. The EMT tried to calm me down. I don't know how to say this to you, but I think you actually saw her ghost, she told me. But don't feel bad about calling us out like this. It's not the first time something weird and as crazy as this has happened to us. I assure you it's not as uncommon as you might actually think. I remember getting back into my truck and shaking violently as I watched the ambulance service leave. I was trembling as I put the key into the ignition again. And then I couldn't believe it. I saw the ghost of the pleading, desperate, dying woman all over again. Please, no, I begged. No, not again. This is just too much. This is more than I can handle. I could not drive through the ghost again, that looked so real, so I climbed out of the truck to inspect the road, but there was nothing there. I really felt like I was going on bonkers, but I know what I saw. The road was still warm to the touch, but there was no sign of blood anywhere. I really was losing it, I thought. The ghost had appeared hauntingly real. Feeling foolish, I got back into the truck, closed my eyes for a few more seconds to avoid seeing the frantic eyes of the ghostly apparition again, and then I hightailed it down that piece of highway as fast as I possibly could. It was a very creepy, insidious feeling that did not leave me for a very long time. It still makes me feel nauseous and queasy when I visit that memory again, as it is a night I cannot forget in a hurry. One night I was driving down the highway, and I very nearly, narrowly missed running over a seemingly beautiful woman that was wearing a very expensive, glamorous fox fur coat, and had suddenly just waddled into the road with a purposeful intent, oblivious to the impending danger of my truck. I remember saying, "What the heck, woman? Why don't you look where you're going? I nearly ran you over." I immediately braked and climbed out of my truck just to check if the woman had recovered from the stunned shock of being nearly run over by my truck. What was she doing in the middle of the highway, wandering around at this time of the night, I wondered. All kinds of horrifying thoughts went rushing through my head, like, was she escaping from a dangerous man or something like that? Could she be possibly in need of my help? I was not prepared for what I was about to see. As you can imagine, it was the 80s, and I was not sure what on earth this extraordinary, peculiar creature actually was. My first thought was, what the heck is this? I had initially thought the 4-foot person was a stunningly beautiful woman wearing a luxurious, glamorous fox fur. But the red fox coat was not a fur coat at all, but a creature that was covered from head to toe in long, luxurious red hair. What on earth was this exceptional creature, I wondered over and over again to myself. I'd never seen anything remotely like it before. It looked like a cross between a human and an ape. I know of no other way to describe it to you. It was standing at the edge of the highway, looking frightened and with very large, big golden brown eyes that seemed dazed, disorientated, and very shocked. The poor creature was trembling with fear because it was so human-like. It was the most natural thing for me to do to comfort it. I think it knew that it had narrowly missed being killed by my truck. "I'm so sorry," I said. "Are you all right?" I reached out to touch one of the hairy arms, and the creature seemed to be momently comforted by my touch. I continued to stroke the creature's arm reassuringly, not knowing what else to do, and it started to make these strange whimpering sounds that sounded really remarkably like a distraught dog. The irony is that the creature even smelt like a dog. It smelt like a wet dog, so to speak. Suddenly gliding across the road towards us were 2 gargantuan forms, the likes of such I've never seen before, and judging by the severe look on their hairless leather faces, they were far from happy, but their irate, frenetic anger was not directed towards me, but to the creature I narrowly missed running over. I realized almost immediately that the little creature was their beloved Sprog, and like any concerned parent, they were happy and fraught all at the same time to be reunited with their little one. For a while I could hear the mother chattering away to her young one in what appeared to be an angry gibberish. The little Sprog looked up at its mother with big wide open eyes and made a whimpering sound which clearly had the effect of pulling at her heartstrings, as she immediately stopped chattering and then ruffled his golden hair on his cone-shaped head as if to say, "It's all forgiven and forgotten, but don't you dare do that again to me." All the while the large male creature, who was clearly the father, never said a single word, but he went over to his youngling and also ruffled the hair on its head affectionately, which I realized must be an expression of love. Then the male stood before me and looked at me very intently with his deep-set golden-brown eyes that seemed to express extreme gratitude. He was literally standing only a foot away from me, so uncomfortably close, in fact, that I could see inside his flat nose, the pink nostrils, and when he breathed, he sounded exactly like a horse. I should have been absolutely terrified because he was so imposing and majestic and lofty and was about 10 foot tall, 1,000 pounds and 5 foot wide. It was like I was standing a foot away from King Kong himself, and I was trembling in my boots. Imagine my amazement when this colossal male put his gargantuan hand and sausage-like fingers on my shoulders and tapped me a couple of times with his overlong hairy hands, in what I believe was an expression of appreciation and extreme gratitude. Then he moved away from me, and I watched these 2 colossal ape-like humanoids that I now know to be Bigfoots glide seamlessly across the road, with the little ones sitting on the father's shoulders looking very happy. I watched them take huge strides over the guardrail, down the embankment, into the woods beyond. They were magnificent to watch, and as they moved their graceful bodies, they almost floated with a seamless grace. It took me years to get over that gratifying, effable experience, which was so magnificent, beautiful, shocking, and hair-raising, all at the very same time, because I had no idea what I'd encountered that day, until many, many long years later, when the subject of Bigfoot was more openly discussed. On another occasion, I was driving my truck through the horrendous rainstorm, and believe me, it was literally bucketing down with rain, and the area had become cloaked in a murky, insidious darkness, and you could hear the ominous rumbles of thunder in the distance and detect a fleeting flash of golden light across the sky, which was, of course, the lightning. I noticed a young boy wearing a bright yellow raincoat with a large hoodie covering his face. He was standing at the side of the road, getting completely soaked and drenched, and waving me down. It was only about 5 in the afternoon at the time, and as it was a rural area, I imagined the boy lived close by. I pulled up my truck over to the side of the road to take a reprieve from this chaotic storm, because I'm not keen at driving in when it's chucking down like this, and on this occasion I thought I'd let the poor drenched kid dry off in my car until the rain did finally recede, as that was the courteous thing to do in this situation. I pulled over to the side of the road and opened the truck door and called out to the boy. "Boy, you can sit in my truck until the rain stops chucking down," I said. The boy got obediently into my truck, and he sat next to me on the opposite seat. He never looked at me once, nor did he acknowledge me, which was decidedly odd. For some reason I could feel chills going up my spine, and my hair was standing on edge, and I became freezing cold. I could sense something was intrinsically wrong, and I was literally begging God inside to make the rain stop so I could get rid of this boy as quickly as I possibly could. The strange boyish form in the yellow raincoat appeared so non-responsive as he sat there, it was giving me the creeps. "Where are you from?" I said, trying to make polite, friendly conversation, and the boy did not answer. I could not see his face clearly because he was staring through the windscreen into the rainstorm, and his face was buried beneath the yellow hoodie. He never said a single word. The spooky, creepy energy he exuded was not like that of a child, but very menacing, duplicitous, and evil. I know of no other way to describe it. Suddenly the boy turned around and looked at me with a huge, ghoulish grin, and he had empty, dark, gnarled hollows where his eldritch eyes should have been. I remember screaming and telling him to get out of my truck. "Get out now!" I screamed. "Get out! Get out!" Suddenly he was gone in a flash of light, and the seat where he'd been sitting was not even remotely wet. Now you explain how that's possible. That gave me the creeps. I looked around for the obnoxious, deranged, devilish boy, but he had gone, seemingly vanished into thin air, and I promise you that nefarious, maniacal experience freaked me out, and I believe that the entity in my truck was not that of a boy at all, but of something diabolically fiendish and demonic that was so terrifying I drove home to my destination shaking and trembling the entire way. I do not recall a time that I was ever more afraid, because my encounter with that prodigious, grotesque boy was like meeting the devil face to face. So there you are, that's my story, which I hope was of interest to your listeners. You'll be glad to know that my brother became a long-haul trucker a year after I did, and he's got some exciting stories to share with you. He luckily escaped our father's brutal clutches as well. I was finally reunited with my mother and sister about 15 years later, and she was no longer the mousy, self-effacing, diffident person I'd once known growing up. It was a very happy reunion, and we became a very close family again, and thankfully we never saw my father, and so I'm clueless about what actually happened to him, and frankly, as heartless and cold as this may sound, I really don't care a jot. Well, what a wonderful story, and I know the listeners are going to have loved that. In fact, I'm almost shaking from your encounter with that creepy boy in the raincoat. Oh my word, I am shaking. I'm literally sitting at the edge of my seat, shaking violently. So I don't think I can even comment on the story until I calm down. Until next time, goodbye and good night.